Part 1. Fathers and Angels. Wes stared back at me after I'd asked my question, letting a moment pass and a smirk flicker across his face before responding. I really haven't thought too deeply about his impact on my life because really, he didn't have one. Wes leaned back in his seat and threw an even stare at me. Come on, man, I pressed on. You don't think about how things would have been different if he'd been there? If he cared enough to be there? No, I don't. The lower half of his face was shrouded by the long beard that he'd grown, an outward sign of the Islamic faith he'd adopted in prison. His eyes danced with bemusement. He was not moved by my emotional questioning. Listen, he went on, your father wasn't there because he couldn't be. My father wasn't there because he chose not to be. We're going to mourn their absence in different ways. This was one of our first visits. I had driven a half hour from my Baltimore home into the woody hills of central Maryland to Jessup Correctional Institution to see Wes. Immediately upon entering the building, I was sternly questioned by an armed guard and searched to ensure I wasn't bringing in anything that could be passed on to Wes. Once I was cleared, another guard escorted me to a larger room that reminded me of a public school cafeteria. This was a secured area where prisoners and their visitors came together. Armed guards systematically paced around the room. Long tables with low metal dividers separating the visitors from the visited were the only furnishings. The prisoners were marched in, dressed in orange or blue jumpsuits or gray sweatsuits with DOC emblazoned across the chest. The uniforms reinforced the myriad other signals around us. The prisoners were owned by the state. Lucky inmates were allowed to sit across regular tables from loved ones. They could exchange an initial hug and then talk face to face. The rest had to talk to their families and friends through bulletproof glass using a telephone, visitor and prisoner connected by receivers they held tight to their ears. Just as I was about to ask another question, Wes interrupted me. Let me ask you a question. You come here and ask me all these questions, but you haven't shared any of yourself up with me. So tell me, what impact did your father not being there have on your childhood? I don't know. I was about to say more when I realized that I didn't really have more to say. Do you miss him? He asked me. Every day, all the time, I replied softly. I was having trouble finding my voice. It always amazed me how I could love so deeply, so intensely, someone I barely knew. I was taught to remember, but never question. Wes was taught to forget and never ask why. We learned our lessons well and were showing them off to a T. We sat there, just a few feet from each other, both silent, pondering in absence.